16 years ago, a 42-year-old mother and bookstore employee in Burlington, Vermont, vanished after leaving her apartment, leaving her teenage daughter waiting at home. Police suspected a late-night robbery gone wrong since her car was missing too. But with no witnesses and limited technology, the investigation eventually hit a dead end. Yet over the years, her sister never gave up, keeping Laura's porch light burning every night, until modern DNA testing cracked open the silence. A detail overlooked in 2009 suddenly revealed a neighbor's betrayal, shaking the quiet Vermont community and changing the course of the case. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more true crime investigations. The thermometer read -8 degrees Fahrenheit when Laura Reyes pulled her burgundy Honda Civic into the employee parking lot behind Pages and Prose bookstore on December 5th. The street lamps cast long shadows across the fresh powder that had been falling steadily since noon, muffling the sounds of downtown Burlington's evening rush hour. Steam rose from manholes along Church Street as the last commuters hurried home, their breath visible in crystalline puffs against the early winter darkness. Laura wrapped her wool scarf tighter around her neck as she locked the bookstore's heavy oak door behind her. At 42, she had worked at the independent bookstore for nearly 7 years, becoming as much a fixture as the leather armchairs by the mystery section where regular customers would spend entire afternoons lost in novels. Her colleagues often remarked how Laura's genuine smile could brighten even the dreariest Vermont winter day, and tonight had been no exception. She'd helped 3 different customers find the perfect holiday gifts, staying 20 minutes past closing to wrap each purchase in the store's signature brown paper. The walk to her car took less than 2 minutes, her boots crunching rhythmically against the packed snow. Laura had texted her 17-year-old daughter Sophia at 6:47 p.m., "Leaving now, sweetie. Pizza's in the freezer if you get hungry before I'm home." The drive from the bookstore to their second-floor apartment on Maple Street typically took 10 minutes, 12 at most when the roads were slick. Sophia had already set the table for 2, expecting to hear her mother's key in the lock by 7 o'clock. But as the minutes ticked past 7, then 7:15, then 7:30, an unfamiliar knot began forming in Sophia's stomach. Her mother was never late without calling. Laura Reyes lived by routines: morning coffee at exactly 6:15, lunch break at noon sharp, and always home by 7 when she worked the evening shift. It was a reliability born from single motherhood. After her divorce from Sophia's father 3 years earlier, Laura had structured their lives around dependable rhythms that gave her teenage daughter security in an uncertain world. Mom always called if she was running even 5 minutes late, Sophia would later tell investigators, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, the phone stayed completely silent. By 8 o'clock, Sophia had called the bookstore 3 times, letting it ring until the voicemail picked up with Laura's recorded voice cheerfully announcing their hours. She tried her mother's cell phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail after the first ring, a sign the phone was either dead or turned off. The apartment felt eerily quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of neighbors' televisions filtering through the thin walls. Laura's estranged ex-husband, Michael, lived 40 minutes away in Montpelier and saw Sophia only every other weekend. When Sophia finally called him at 8:30, desperation creeping into her voice, even Michael admitted this behavior was completely unlike Laura. Despite their bitter divorce proceedings that had stretched over 2 contentious years, he acknowledged that Laura was fiercely protective of Sophia and would never disappear without explanation. The last person to see Laura alive was her co-worker Janet Morrison, who had watched through the bookstore's front window as Laura scraped ice from her windshield and pulled out of the parking lot. Janet remembered thinking how the falling snow made everything look like a Christmas card, peaceful and pristine. She had waved goodbye, never imagining it would be the last time she'd see her friend's familiar silhouette. What began as an ordinary winter night in a quiet Vermont town quickly became the darkest chapter in the Reyes family's life, setting into motion an investigation that would span nearly 2 decades and ultimately expose a betrayal hiding in plain sight. At 12:43 a.m., on December 16, 2009, Sophia Reyes's hands trembled as she dialed 911 from the landline in her mother's bedroom. The dispatcher's calm voice seemed to echo in the empty apartment as Sophia struggled to explain that her mother had vanished somewhere between the bookstore and home. The 10-minute drive had stretched into nearly 6 hours of agonizing silence, and Sophia knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. Officer David Chen was the first to arrive at 47 Maple Street, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the swirling snow as he climbed the narrow staircase to the Reyes apartment. At 19 years old and fresh from the police academy, Chen had never handled a missing person case, but he could immediately sense the gravity in Sophia's red-rimmed eyes and the way she clutched her mother's work schedule like a lifeline. The apartment told its own story of interrupted routine. Laura's morning coffee mug sat washed and dried beside the sink. Her uniform from the previous day's shift hung neatly in the closet, and her bed was made with hospital corners, the kind of precision that spoke to someone who planned to return home. Most telling was the kitchen table set for two with Laura's favorite blue ceramic plates and cloth napkins, a small ritual she and Sophia had maintained even through the chaos of divorce proceedings. "She was supposed to be here," Sophia kept repeating, her voice breaking. "She's never late. She's never late," without calling. Chen radioed for backup and began the methodical process of documenting Laura's last known movements. He noted that her purse, keys, and cell phone were all missing, consistent with her having left work normally. Her winter coat was gone from its usual hook by the door, but her house slippers sat expectantly by her bed, and her reading glasses lay folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished romance novel bookmarked at page. Within an hour, officers Sarah Martinez and Jim Sullivan arrived to assist, followed closely by Detective Lieutenant Rebecca Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Burlington Police Department. Walsh had investigated dozens of missing person cases, and she immediately recognized the signs that distinguish genuine emergencies from teenage runaways or marital disputes. Laura Reyes fit none of the typical flight risk profiles. She had a stable job, close relationship with her daughter, and no history of erratic behavior. The initial canvassing began at 2:15 a.m., with officers knocking on doors throughout the Maple Street neighborhood. Most residents were asleep, answering their doors in bathrobes and slippers, blinking against the glare of flashlights. Margaret Patterson, who lived directly across the hall from the Reyes apartment, confirmed she had seen Laura leave for work that afternoon around 4 p.m. but hadn't heard her return. The building's thin walls typically carried the sound of footsteps and closing doors, and Margaret was known to notice the comings and goings of her neighbors. Below the Reyes apartment, Tom Brennan, a 38-year-old handyman who had lived in the building for 8 years, emerged sleepy-eyed but concerned when officers knocked. He told them he'd been watching television until around 11 p.m., but hadn't heard Laura's distinctive Honda Civic in the parking lot. Tom knew the sound of her car because his own apartment window faced the small lot behind the building, and he often waved to Laura when she returned from work. "She usually parks right under that streetlight," Tom explained, pointing to the empty space where Laura's burgundy Honda should have been. "I would have heard her pull in. That car's got a little rattle in the engine that you can't miss." The building's other residents, an elderly couple on the first floor and a graduate student who worked nights, provided similar accounts. No one had seen or heard Laura return home, and more critically, no one had witnessed anything suspicious or unusual in the neighborhood that evening. By 4 a.m., Detective Walsh had established a preliminary timeline. Laura had left the bookstore at approximately 6:50 p.m., based on Janet Morrison's account and the store's security system logs. Her cell phone had last connected to the nearest tower at 6:52 p.m., just 2 blocks from Pages and Prose. After that moment, Laura Reyes had simply vanished into the Vermont winter night, leaving behind only questions and a daughter who would spend the next 16 years searching for answers. As dawn broke gray and cold over Burlington, the initial missing person report transformed into something far more ominous, the beginning of an investigation that would challenge everything the community thought they knew about safety, trust, and the people living quietly among them. Dawn on December 16th brought no relief to the Reyes family's nightmare, only the harsh reality of a mother and her car missing without a trace. Detective Lieutenant Rebecca Walsh arrived at the Burlington Fire Department Station 4 at 6:30 a.m. to establish a command post, the department's conference room quickly transforming into a nerve center of maps, phone banks, and coordination boards. The station's location on North Avenue provided strategic access to the city's main arteries and quick deployment to the surrounding countryside where searchers would soon fan out across frozen Vermont terrain. Chief of Police Michael Rodriguez authorized a full-scale search operation by 7 a.m., a decision that reflected both the urgency of Laura's disappearance and the department's assessment that this case fell far outside normal parameters. Rodriguez, a Burlington native who had worked his way up through the ranks over 23 years, knew that the first 48 hours in a missing person investigation often determined whether families received answers or spent decades wondering. The search teams assembled under overcast skies threatening more snow, their breath visible in the 20-degree air as Walsh briefed them on Laura's physical description. 5'4" tall, 35 pounds, shoulder-length dark brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing a navy blue winter coat and black boots. Her burgundy 2006 Honda Civic, license plate VT-HDR 892, remained the searchers' primary target, a car that should have been nearly impossible to hide in Burlington's tight-knit neighborhoods where residents noticed unfamiliar vehicles. K-9 officer Patricia Williams arrived with Rex, a 7-year-old German Shepherd trained in both search and rescue and cadaver detection. Rex had successfully located missing persons across Vermont's challenging terrain, from dense forests to frozen lakes, but the fresh snowfall presented complications. The overnight accumulation had covered any scent trails Laura might have left, forcing the search teams to rely more heavily on visual identification and systematic grid searches. The first search radius extended 3 miles from Laura's last known location at Pages and Prose, covering downtown Burlington's maze of narrow streets, parking garages, and commercial districts. Teams of 4 officers each combed through alleyways behind businesses, checked dumpsters despite the grisly implications, and knocked on doors at every residence and business along Laura's most likely route home. The methodical process required nearly 8 hours to complete, with each team reporting back negative results every 30 minutes. Helicopter support arrived from the Vermont State Police at 11 a.m., the aircraft's thermal imaging equipment, scanning the Winooski River and surrounding woodlands for any signs of Laura or her vehicle. Pilot Lieutenant James Morrison, no relation to Laura's co-worker, Janet, flew grid patterns over areas where a car might have left the road or been deliberately concealed. The thermal cameras could detect heat signatures from a recently driven vehicle, or more grimly from a human body even hours after death. But Vermont's winter landscape presented unique challenges that southern investigators rarely faced. The frozen ground made digging virtually impossible, while thick snow cover could easily hide a vehicle or body until spring thaw. Lakes and ponds had begun forming ice, creating potential burial sites that would remain inaccessible for months. Detective Walsh found herself constantly recalculating search priorities based on weather conditions that seemed to actively work against their efforts. Community volunteers began arriving at the fire station by noon, bringing thermoses of coffee, homemade sandwiches, and a determination to find their missing neighbor. Burlington's population of just over 40,000 created the kind of tight-knit community where Laura's disappearance felt personal to hundreds of residents who had never met her but recognized her from the bookstore or had heard about the case through friends and family networks. Martha Hendricks, who owned the bakery 3 blocks from Pages and Prose, organized civilian search teams with military precision. She divided volunteers into groups based on physical ability and local knowledge, sending the most experienced hikers toward the wooded areas around Burlington's outskirts, while keeping elderly volunteers focused on checking parking lots and business districts. Martha's husband had disappeared during a fishing trip 15 years earlier, and she understood both the family's desperate need for action and the importance of conducting searches safely and systematically. By evening, over 200 volunteers had participated in the search efforts, covering nearly 15 square miles of terrain, without finding any trace of Laura or her Honda Civic. The systematic approach had eliminated most of the obvious possibilities: car accidents along main roads, medical emergencies in public places, or simple mechanical breakdowns that might have left Laura stranded, but alive. Despite the exhaustive efforts and community support, The first day's searches yielded only frustration and growing concern. As teams reported back with negative results, Detective Walsh faced the sobering reality that Laura Reyes had not simply encountered bad luck or poor timing. Something far more sinister had interrupted her journey home, and the investigation was about to enter much darker territory than anyone in Burlington wanted to contemplate. The Unitarian Universalist Church on Pearl Street had never hosted a vigil quite like the one that formed spontaneously on December 18th, just 3 days after Laura Reyes vanished. Reverend Michael Thompson opened the sanctuary's heavy wooden doors to find nearly 300 people gathered in the bitter cold, their faces illuminated by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows across the church's stone facade. The crowd included familiar faces from throughout Burlington. Teachers from the high school where Sophia was a senior, regular customers from Pages and Prose, and dozens of neighbors who had never spoken to Laura but felt compelled to stand witness to her disappearance. Janet Morrison stood near the front of the crowd, clutching a framed photo of Laura taken at the bookstore's holiday party just 2 weeks earlier. In the picture, Laura was laughing at something outside the camera's view, her eyes bright with the kind of genuine joy that had made her a beloved figure among the store's customers. Janet had worked alongside Laura for 4 years, sharing countless lunch breaks and closing duties, but she struggled to find words that could capture her friend's warmth and dedication to her teenage daughter. Laura was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who asked about your sick grandmother, who stayed late to help you find exactly the right book, Janet told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the winter air. She didn't just sell books, she connected stories to people's lives, and now her own story has been interrupted, and we're all here because we refuse to let it end in silence. The vigil had been organized primarily through word of mouth and a simple flyer posted at the bookstore, but news of Laura's disappearance had spread throughout Vermont's interconnected communities with remarkable speed. Small-town networks that typically carried gossip about school board elections and high school sports scores now buzzed with theories, speculation, and offers of help. The case had struck a nerve that went beyond simple neighborly concern. Laura represented the kind of ordinary safety that every parent took for granted, and her disappearance had shattered assumptions about security in a community where people still left their doors unlocked. Behind the scenes, Detective Walsh was fielding an overwhelming volume of tips from community members eager to help solve the mystery. The police department's phone lines had been ringing constantly since Laura's disappearance became public knowledge, with calls ranging from credible observations to psychic visions to elaborate conspiracy theories. Each tip required documentation and follow-up investigation, creating a massive workload for Burlington's small detective unit. The most promising early lead came from gas station clerk Danny Moreau, who worked the overnight shift at the Citgo station on North Avenue. Danny called police on December 17th to report that he thought he had seen Laura's Honda Civic around 11 p.m. on December 15th, several hours after she had disappeared. According to Danny's account, a burgundy Honda matching Laura's car description had pulled up to pump number 3, but the driver, a figure he couldn't clearly see through tinted windows, had sat in the vehicle for several minutes without getting out before driving away without purchasing gas. It was weird behavior, Danny explained to Detective Martinez during his formal interview. People don't usually sit at the pumps unless they're making a phone call or something, but this person just sat there, engine running, for maybe 5 minutes. When I came out to see if they needed help, the car pulled away real fast. The gas station's security cameras had captured the incident, but the nighttime lighting and poor resolution made it impossible to definitively identify the vehicle as Laura's Honda or to see the driver clearly. The timestamp showed 11:17 p.m., which would have placed the sighting more than 4 hours after Laura's disappearance, a timeline that raised disturbing questions about what had happened during those missing hours. Another significant tip came from Margaret Stevens, a retired teacher who lived on the route between Pages and Prose and Laura's apartment. Margaret had been walking her elderly collie around 7:15 p.m. on December 15th, when she noticed a burgundy car parked along Elmwood Avenue with its hazard lights flashing. She remembered thinking the driver might be having car trouble, but when she walked past the same spot 20 minutes later, the car was gone. Margaret couldn't be certain it was Laura's Honda, but the timing and location fit the investigation's parameters perfectly. These early leads created a flurry of activity as investigators attempted to reconstruct Laura's movements and identify potential witnesses. Detective Walsh organized neighborhood canvassing teams to knock on every door within a 6-block radius of Margaret Stevens' sighting, hoping to find additional witnesses who might have noticed the car or its occupants. The systematic approach yielded dozens of interviews, but no conclusive evidence about Laura's fate. The community's response extended far beyond vigils and tip calls. Local businesses began displaying missing posters featuring Laura's photograph and description, while the Burlington Free Press ran daily updates on the investigation's progress. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast Laura's information, and social media, still relatively new in 2009, buzzed with shared posts and theories about her disappearance. But beneath the surface of community solidarity, darker currents were beginning to emerge. Whispered conversations in coffee shops and grocery store checkout lines carried speculation about Laura's personal life, her recent divorce, and possible connections to her ex-husband despite his solid alibi. The case was becoming a mirror that reflected Burlington's assumptions about crime, safety, and the kinds of people who became victims of violence. As the investigation entered its second week, the early leads were beginning to unravel under scrutiny, leaving investigators with more questions than answers and a community growing increasingly anxious about the safety of their quiet Vermont town. The Burlington Police Department's conference room had been transformed into a war room by December 22, its walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs that told the story of an investigation growing more complex by the day. Detective Lieutenant Rebecca Walsh stood before a whiteboard filled with color-coded information, red for confirmed facts, blue for witness statements, yellow for unverified tips, trying to identify patterns in what increasingly appeared to be a case without logical progression or clear suspects. The forensic limitations of 2009 were becoming painfully apparent as investigators struggled to extract meaningful evidence from the few physical traces Laura had left behind. Her cell phone had gone dark at 6:52 p.m. on December 15, with the last tower ping placing her just 2 blocks from Pages and Pros. The phone company's records showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to her disappearance. No threatening calls, no communications with unknown numbers, nothing that suggested Laura had been in contact with someone who might wish her harm. More frustrating was the complete absence of surveillance footage from Laura's road home. In 2009, security cameras were far less prevalent than they would become just a few years later, and the cameras that did exist often produced grainy, low-resolution images that were difficult to analyze. The traffic light cameras at 2 major intersections along Laura's road had captured dozens of vehicles on December 15, but identifying specific cars or license plates proved nearly impossible due to the poor image quality and winter weather conditions. Detective Walsh found herself repeatedly returning to the most likely scenario. Laura had encountered her attacker somewhere between the bookstore and her apartment, a stretch of road she had traveled safely hundreds of times before. But without witnesses, physical evidence, or any indication of Laura's movements after leaving work, the investigation was essentially attempting to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The focus inevitably shifted to Laura's ex-husband, Michael Reyes, whose contentious divorce from Laura had been finalized just 18 months earlier. Detective Martinez spent 3 full days investigating Michael's background, interviewing his coworkers at the accounting firm where he worked in Montpelier, and examining his financial records for any signs of threats or harassment toward his former wife. Michael had agreed to multiple interviews without requesting an attorney, seemingly eager to cooperate with investigators despite the obvious suspicions surrounding him. His alibi for December 15 was solid. He had attended a mandatory training session at his firm until 6 p.m., then gone directly to dinner with 2 colleagues at a restaurant in downtown Montpelier. Credit card receipts, witness statements, and restaurant security footage confirmed his presence at the dinner until nearly 9 p.m., making it physically impossible for him to have intercepted Laura on her drive home. "I know how this looks," Michael told Detective Walsh during their final interview on December 28. "Divorce cases, statistics about domestic violence, I get it. But Laura and I were done fighting. We'd moved past the anger. Our only concern was making sure Sophia had stability. And Laura disappearing serves nobody's interests, especially not mine. Despite the personal animosity that clearly remained between the divorced couple, Michael's grief appeared genuine, and his cooperation with investigators seemed complete. He provided access to his phone records, email accounts, and financial information without hesitation. More importantly, he had no motive that investigators could identify. The divorce settlement was complete, custody arrangements were working smoothly, and both parties had moved on to separate lives with minimal contact. The investigation's dead ends extended beyond suspect identification to basic evidence collection. Laura's Honda Civic remained missing, despite extensive searches and a statewide BOLO alert that had been distributed to every law enforcement agency in New England. The car should have been nearly impossible to hide. Vermont's rural roads and small communities made it difficult to dispose of vehicles without someone noticing, yet weeks of searching had yielded no trace of the burgundy Honda. Forensic analysis of Laura's apartment and workplace provided no useful evidence. Her computer showed only routine internet activity, email correspondence with friends, online banking, and research for book recommendations at work. Her phone records revealed normal communications with family members, co-workers, and a few close friends, but nothing that suggested threats or unusual relationships. Laura's financial records showed modest but stable income, regular bill payments, and no large withdrawals or suspicious transactions. The lack of physical evidence was particularly frustrating, given the advanced forensic techniques that were just beginning to become standard practice in criminal investigations. DNA analysis was still expensive and time-consuming in 2009, limiting its use to cases with clear biological evidence. Without blood, hair, or other obvious forensic materials, investigators had little to analyze even if the technology had been readily available. By January 2010, the Laura Reyes investigation had generated over 400 pages of reports, interviews, and documentation, but Detective Walsh was no closer to understanding what had happened to the missing mother than she had been on the first night. The case files told the story of a woman who had simply vanished mid-journey, leaving behind no enemies, no obvious motives for foul play, and no trace of her movements after leaving work. The investigation was about to enter its most difficult phase, the slow transition from active case to cold case, as leads dried up and the trail grew colder with each passing day. But Detective Walsh refused to give up, filing Laura's case in a special section of her desk, where it would remain easily accessible, waiting for the breakthrough that she believed would eventually come. The porch light at 47 Maple Street had been burning continuously for 6 months, when Maria Santos made her first pilgrimage to Burlington in June. Laura's older sister had driven up from Springfield, Massachusetts, carrying a bag of replacement bulbs and a determination that had only grown stronger as the official investigation wound down. Standing in the empty parking space where Laura's Honda Civic should have been, Maria made a promise that would define the next 15 years of her life. The light would stay on until Laura came home. Every night when people drive by this building, I want them to remember that she's still missing, Maria explained to Sophia as they changed the bulb together, the simple ritual already becoming sacred between them. I want them to think about Laura, to wonder if maybe they saw something, remembered something. Hope is the only weapon we have left. The daily routine of grief had settled into the Reyes household like an unwelcome boarder, reshaping every ordinary moment around Laura's absence. Sophia, now 18 and preparing for her senior year of high school, had learned to set the table for one while still automatically buying groceries for two. Her mother's coffee mug remained in its place beside the sink, washed and ready, a shrine to optimism that became more heartbreaking with each passing day. The financial strain of Laura's disappearance had created challenges that insurance companies and legal systems weren't designed to handle. Without a death certificate, Laura's modest life insurance policy remained inaccessible, while her checking account had been frozen as part of the ongoing investigation. Sophia found herself dependent on financial support from Maria and from the small emergency fund that Burlington's faith community had quietly assembled, a safety net that allowed her to finish high school without the additional trauma of losing her home. Detective Walsh continued to work Laura's case, But with no new leads and mounting pressure to focus on active investigations, the file had officially transitioned to cold case status in March. The detective had promised Maria that she would personally review the case file every 6 months, looking for connections to new crimes or opportunities to apply advancing forensic technologies. It was a commitment that went beyond departmental requirements, born from Walsh's recognition that some cases demanded persistent attention regardless of official status. The community's initial surge of support had gradually faded as months passed without resolution, replaced by a more subdued but persistent awareness of Laura's story. Pages and Prose maintained a small memorial display near the register, Laura's employee photo alongside a collection of her favorite book recommendations that served as a daily reminder to customers and staff alike. Regular patrons would sometimes ask about the investigation's progress, keeping Laura's memory alive in everyday conversations about books and reading. But the most profound impact of Laura's disappearance was visible in how Burlington's residents had subtly altered their daily routines. Women who had previously thought nothing of walking alone to their cars after dark now traveled in groups or asked for escorts. Parents who had allowed their teenagers considerable independence began implementing check-in calls and curfews. The case had introduced a new vocabulary of caution into a community that had considered itself immune to random violence. Maria's visits to Burlington became monthly, then weekly, as she took on the role of keeping Laura's case visible in public consciousness. She organized annual vigils on the anniversary of Laura's disappearance, maintained a simple website with updates and appeals for information, and cultivated relationships with local media to ensure Laura's story received periodic coverage. Maria understood that cold cases were often solved by persistence rather than brilliant detective work, and she was prepared to maintain that pressure indefinitely. The relationship between Maria and Sophia had deepened through shared grief, but it was complicated by their different approaches to hope and healing. Sophia, facing the developmental challenges of late adolescence, without her primary parent, sometimes resented Maria's militant optimism and public activism. There were arguments about whether keeping Laura's room exactly as she had left it was healthy or obsessive, whether talking constantly about the case helped or hindered the healing process. "Some days I just want to forget for a few hours," Sophia confided to her high school counselor during one particularly difficult session. "I want to be a normal teenager worried about college applications and prom dates. But then I feel guilty, like forgetting about Mom for even a little while means I'm giving up on her." The empty chair at the kitchen table became the focal point of holiday celebrations that were simultaneously memorial services and expressions of stubborn hope. Christmas 2010 featured wrapped presents for Laura beneath a tree that felt more like a shrine than a celebration. Her birthday in February became an annual community gathering that drew smaller crowds each year but maintained the same intensity of purpose, keeping Laura Reyes visible in a world that naturally moved forward from tragedy. By the second anniversary of Laura's disappearance in December 2011, the case had settled into a rhythm of quiet persistence punctuated by moments of renewed hope. Detective Walsh would call with updates about new forensic technologies or potential connections to other cases, meetings that always ended with the same commitment to continue searching for answers. The porch light continued to burn each night, a beacon that had become as much a part of the neighborhood's landscape as the street lamps and stop signs, visible to anyone who knew what it meant. A family's refusal to accept that some questions would remain forever unanswered. By 2015, the missing person poster of Laura Reyes had become part of Burlington's urban landscape, as familiar and overlooked as bus stop advertisements or utility pole announcements. The once bright photographs had faded to sepia tones, their edges curled and weathered from 6 Vermont winters, but they remained posted throughout the city, a testament to Maria Santos's relentless advocacy and the community's complicated relationship with an unsolved mystery that refused to fade away. The morning regulars at Henry's Diner on Church Street had developed their own informal theory sessions over coffee and pie, conversations that had evolved from urgent speculation to comfortable ritual over the years. Betty Marchand, who had worked the morning shift for 15 years, could predict which customers would bring up Laura's case and when. Usually during the slow period between breakfast and lunch rushes, when the restaurant's familiar rhythms invited deeper conversations about the mysteries that shaped their small city. "People need to talk about it," Betty would explain to newer employees, who seemed uncomfortable with the recurring discussions. "Not talking about it would be like pretending it never happened, and that feels disrespectful to Laura and her family. So we keep her memory alive the only way we know how." The conversations had shifted significantly from their early focus on suspects and theories to broader questions about safety and trust in their community. Parents who had raised children in Burlington through the 1990s and 2000s found themselves reluctant to grant the same freedoms they had enjoyed, implementing safety protocols that would have seemed paranoid before Laura's disappearance. The case had become a reference point for measuring risk, a cautionary tale that influenced decisions about everything from teenage curfews to walking routes after dark. At Pages and Prose, the memorial display for Laura had evolved into something approaching a permanent installation. New employees learned about Laura's dedication to matching customers with perfect books, her knowledge of the mystery section, and her habit of recommending lesser-known authors to adventurous readers. The stories had taken on the quality of legend, growing richer and more detailed with each retelling, ensuring that Laura remained a living presence in the bookstore's daily operations. Janet Morrison, now the store's assistant manager, had become the unofficial keeper of Laura's professional legacy. She maintained the memorial display with fresh flowers on significant dates, organized annual book drives in Laura's honor, and continued recommending titles using the extensive notes Laura had left in the store's customer database. For Janet, keeping Laura's memory alive at work was both tribute and therapy, a way of processing grief that had never found complete resolution. The impact on Burlington's social fabric extended beyond individual families to institutional changes that reflected the community's attempt to prevent future tragedies. The police department had implemented new protocols for missing person cases, reducing the waiting period before investigations began, and improving coordination with state and federal agencies. The changes were directly influenced by lessons learned from Laura's case, acknowledging that small-town police departments needed better resources and training to handle complex investigations. Detective Walsh, now a captain with the department, had become something of a regional expert on cold cases, frequently consulting with other agencies on similar investigations. Laura's case had shaped her career in unexpected ways, leading to specialized training in forensic technologies and victim advocacy that benefited the entire department. The professional growth felt like a form of honor for Laura's memory, though Walsh was careful never to express gratitude for the tragedy that had catalyzed her development. The annual vigils had evolved into broader community safety initiatives, with Maria Santos organizing self-defense classes, safety awareness workshops, and campaigns to improve lighting in downtown areas. The activism had given Maria's grief a productive outlet, while creating tangible benefits for Burlington residents, particularly women who had felt vulnerable since Laura's disappearance. The transformation of personal tragedy into community service exemplified the way Burlington had chosen to process its collective trauma. But the passage of time had also created subtle divisions within the community, between those who maintained active concern about Laura's case and those who had moved on to more immediate priorities. Newcomers to Burlington often had no knowledge of Laura's disappearance until they noticed the faded posters or heard conversations at local businesses. The case had become a marker of community membership. Longtime residents shared the collective memory, while newer arrivals learned about it as historical context. The economic impact was harder to quantify, but undeniably real. Burlington's reputation as a safe, family-friendly community had been complicated by Laura's unsolved disappearance, influencing everything from tourism marketing to real estate values. The city's promotional materials now emphasized community solidarity and safety initiatives, rather than simply assuming that small-town Vermont was inherently secure. The changes reflected a loss of innocence that went beyond individual grief to encompass collective identity. By 2018, nearly a decade after Laura's disappearance, Burlington had learned to live with unresolved mystery in ways that would have seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath of the case. The porch light at 47 Maple Street continued to burn each night, but it had been joined by security lights and video cameras throughout the neighborhood as residents invested in technologies that promised the illusion of safety. The community had adapted to carrying Laura's story forward, while continuing to build lives and futures that honored her memory without being paralyzed by her absence. The Vermont State Police Crime Laboratory in Waterbury looked nothing like the CSI laboratories that television viewers had come to expect. No dramatic lighting or sleek equipment displays, just fluorescent fixtures illuminating rows of computers, microscopes, and analytical instruments housed in a converted office building that had once been an insurance company headquarters. But on March 15, 2023, this unremarkable facility would become the setting for a breakthrough that had taken 14 years to achieve. Forensic analyst Dr. Sarah Chen had joined the lab's cold case unit just 6 months earlier, bringing with her a PhD in molecular biology and extensive experience with advanced DNA sequencing technologies that were only becoming standard practice in Vermont's smaller laboratories. At 32 years old, Dr. Chen represented a new generation of forensic scientists who had grown up alongside the rapid evolution of genetic analysis, treating as routine the techniques that had been cutting-edge research just a decade earlier. The Laura Reyes case file had been assigned to Dr. Chen as part of a systematic review of cold cases with potential DNA evidence, a project funded by federal grants designed to help smaller jurisdictions take advantage of technological advances. The evidence in Laura's case was minimal. Fiber samples collected from her Honda Civic when it was finally discovered in a remote parking area 3 weeks after her disappearance, along with fingerprint lifts that had been too degraded to process using tools. When I first opened Laura's file, I wasn't particularly optimistic, Dr. Chen would later explain to Detective Walsh. The fiber evidence was limited, and 14 years of storage doesn't always preserve DNA well. But the new SDR analysis techniques can sometimes extract profiles from samples that would have been useless even 5 years ago. The fibers in question had been collected from the Honda's passenger seat, short, dark strands that didn't match Laura's hair or any clothing found in her apartment. In 2009, the samples had been too small and degraded to yield usable DNA profiles using the CODIS markers that were standard at the time. But advances in low copy number DNA analysis and next-generation sequencing had dramatically increased the sensitivity of genetic testing, allowing scientists to develop profiles from just a few cells. Dr. Chen's initial analysis confirmed that the fiber samples contained DNA from an unknown male subject, a finding that immediately elevated the evidence's significance. The genetic profile showed no matches in CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, but it provided a complete genetic fingerprint that could be compared against any potential suspects. For the first time since 2009, investigators had a concrete lead that could definitively link a suspect to Laura's disappearance. The breakthrough came during Dr. Chen's third week working on the case, when she decided to apply familial DNA searching techniques that had gained prominence in recent years through cases like the Golden State Killer investigation. Rather than looking for exact matches in criminal databases, familial searching identified relatives of unknown subjects, using genetic genealogy to narrow down potential suspect pools through family trees and public DNA databases. The profile we extracted suggested the unknown male was of European ancestry, with some Irish and Eastern European markers. Dr. Chen explained to the investigative team that had assembled to review her findings. When we ran it through the familial databases, we got several potential matches within a reasonable geographic range of Vermont. The genetic genealogy analysis identified 3 possible family lines that could have produced the unknown DNA profile, with family members living in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Each family tree required careful investigation to identify male relatives who would have been in the Burlington area in December 2009 and had some connection to Laura or her routine activities. Detective Captain Walsh, now leading the cold case review, felt a familiar surge of excitement mixed with caution as she reviewed Dr. Chen's findings. After 14 years of dead ends and false leads, the DNA evidence represented the first objective breakthrough in the investigation. But she had learned from experience that forensic advances created new possibilities rather than guaranteed solutions, and careful police work would still be required to transform genetic information into criminal charges. The investigative team faced a delicate challenge in using the DNA information without alerting potential suspects to the breakthrough. Familial DNA searching had raised privacy concerns and legal challenges in other jurisdictions, requiring careful attention to constitutional protections and proper procedures for collecting comparison samples from potential suspects. "We have to be methodical and patient," Captain Walsh cautioned her team during their first briefing on the DNA findings. "This evidence gives us a roadmap, but we still need to build a case that will stand up in court." After 14 years, we owe Laura's family nothing less than a conviction that sticks. The breakthrough had arrived at a time when cold case investigations were being revolutionized by technological advances. But success still required the same careful police work that had always been necessary to transform leads into arrests. The DNA evidence pointed toward answers, but the most difficult part of the investigation was just beginning. The genealogy research that followed Dr. Chen's DNA breakthrough required 6 weeks of painstaking investigation, cross-referencing family trees with voter registration records, employment histories, and address databases to identify potential suspects who would have had access to Laura Reyes. In December, Detective Captain Walsh had assembled a small task force that included Detective Martinez, now a lieutenant with the department, and FBI consultant Agent Rachel Morrison, whose expertise in genetic genealogy had proven crucial in similar cold cases across New England. The investigation had narrowed to 12 potential suspects across 3 family lines, each requiring careful background investigation to determine opportunity, means, and potential motives for harming Laura. Most of the candidates were quickly eliminated: men who had been living in other states in 2009, elderly relatives with no connection to Burlington, or individuals with solid alibis for the relevant time period. But one name on the list had immediately caught Detective Walsh's attention: Thomas Brennan, the handyman who had lived in Laura's apartment building for 8 years. Tom Brennan had been interviewed multiple times during the original investigation, always as a witness rather than a suspect. He had provided detailed information about the building's routines, Laura's typical schedule, and his observations from the night she disappeared. His cooperation had seemed complete and genuine, and investigators had found nothing suspicious about his background or behavior. But genetic genealogy had now placed him in the same family line as the unknown DNA contributor, making him a person of interest in ways that traditional investigation had never suggested. The challenge facing investigators was collecting a comparison DNA sample from Brennan without alerting him to their suspicions, a delicate process that required both legal precision and tactical planning. Surveillance teams had been monitoring Brennan's daily routines for 2 weeks, looking for opportunities to collect discarded items that might yield DNA evidence. The 56-year-old handyman lived alone in the same apartment building where Laura had disappeared, maintaining the same job and lifestyle that had made him an apparently credible witness 14 years earlier. The breakthrough came on April 23, 2023, when surveillance officers observed Brennan discarding a coffee cup in a public trash receptacle outside Murphy's hardware store, where he had been purchasing supplies for a maintenance job. The cup was carefully retrieved and transported to Chen's laboratory, where DNA extraction could be performed under controlled conditions that would ensure the evidence's admissibility in court proceedings. Dr. Chen's analysis of the coffee cup DNA took 3 days to complete, time that felt endless to investigators who had been waiting 14 years for this moment. When the results arrived, they confirmed what the genetic genealogy had suggested. Thomas Brennan's DNA was a perfect match for the unknown male profile extracted from the fiber evidence in Laura's Honda Civic. The probability of this match occurring by random chance is approximately 1 in 3.2 billion, Dr. Chen reported to the investigative team. From a scientific perspective, we can say with virtual certainty that Thomas Brennan was in Laura Reyes's vehicle at some point, likely around the time of her disappearance. The DNA evidence transformed the entire investigation, casting new light on every interaction Brennan had with police during the original inquiry. Detective Martinez spent hours reviewing the interview transcripts from 2009, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception that might have been missed when Brennan was considered merely a helpful witness. Several details that had seemed innocuous 14 years earlier now appeared potentially significant. During his December 2009 interviews, Brennan had mentioned hearing Laura's car engine on multiple occasions, describing its distinctive rattle with unusual specificity. He had provided detailed information about Laura's schedule and habits, knowledge that seemed helpful at the time, but could now be interpreted as evidence of inappropriate surveillance. Most troubling, Brennan had volunteered information about his own whereabouts and activities that hadn't been requested, possibly indicating consciousness of guilt. But the DNA evidence raised as many questions as it answered. How had Brennan's genetic material ended up in Laura's car? When had he been inside the vehicle? Was his presence evidence of a consensual interaction that had gone wrong, or proof of abduction and violence? The investigators needed additional evidence to construct a coherent narrative that would support criminal charges and withstand scrutiny in court. The task force began developing a comprehensive surveillance and investigation plan designed to gather additional evidence while maintaining operational security. Brennan's daily activities, social connections, and communication patterns would all be monitored for signs of suspicious behavior or admissions of guilt. His apartment would be searched if probable cause could be established, though investigators recognized that 14 years had likely eliminated most physical evidence from the original crime. Most importantly, the team needed to locate Laura's remains, both to provide closure for her family and to strengthen the case against Brennan. The handyman's intimate knowledge of Burlington's galaxy and his access to construction sites and remote locations would have given him numerous options for concealing evidence. Advanced ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dog searches would be required, but investigators first needed to narrow their search parameters based on Brennan's movements and capabilities. The revelation that Laura's trusted neighbor had likely been responsible for her disappearance sent shockwaves through the investigative team, all of whom remembered Brennan's apparent cooperation and concern during the original investigation. The case had become a stark reminder that predators often hide in plain sight, using positions of trust and familiarity to access victims and deflect suspicion. As April 2023 drew to a close, investigators knew they were closing in on answers that had eluded them for nearly a decade and a half, but they also recognized that the most dangerous phase of the investigation was just beginning. The arrest warrant for Thomas Michael Brennan was signed at 4:47 a.m. on May 8, 2023, in the chambers of Judge Patricia Hoffman, who had been awakened at her home to review the probable cause affidavit that Detective Captain Walsh had spent the previous night preparing. The document outlined 14 years of investigation, culminating in DNA evidence that placed Brennan inside Laura Reyes's vehicle, creating sufficient grounds for arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder. Judge Hoffman's signature activated a carefully choreographed operation that would bring one of Vermont's longest-running cold cases to its dramatic conclusion. The tactical team assembled in the darkness at Burlington Police Headquarters included members of the department's SWAT unit, FBI agents, and Detective Martinez, whose 14-year involvement in the case had earned her a place in the arrest operation. The plan called for simultaneous execution of arrest and search warrants at 6 a.m., time to minimize the risk of Brennan fleeing or destroying evidence, while ensuring officer safety during what could be a dangerous confrontation with a suspected killer. 47 Maple Street looked unchanged from the building where Laura Reyes had lived 14 years earlier, its brick facade and narrow entrance showing the wear of New England winters, but maintaining the modest dignity of working-class housing. The building's residents included several tenants who had lived there during Laura's disappearance, creating an audience of witnesses who would watch their longtime neighbor's arrest with a mixture of shock and horrified recognition. At exactly 6 a.m., the tactical team positioned itself outside Brennan's first-floor apartment, while Detective Captain Walsh knocked on the door and announced their presence. "Thomas Brennan, this is Burlington Police. We have a warrant for your arrest. Please open the door and come out with your hands visible." The response came after nearly 30 seconds of silence, shuffling footsteps, the sound of a chain lock being released, and then the door opening to reveal a man whose appearance had changed dramatically from the helpful witness. At 56, Brennan looked older than his years, with gray stubble and the kind of weariness that suggested he might have been expecting this moment for longer than anyone realized. "I knew this day would come," Brennan said quietly, as handcuffs were applied, a statement that would later be cited as evidence of consciousness of guilt. His cooperation during the arrest was complete. No resistance, no attempts to flee, no demands for explanations that might have been expected from an innocent person surprised by police action. The search of Brennan's apartment revealed a space that had been carefully maintained but felt frozen in time, as if its occupant had been living in suspended animation for more than a decade. The most significant discovery was a collection of newspaper clippings about Laura's case, meticulously organized in a folder that included articles from the initial investigation, anniversary coverage, and updates about the cold case review. The clippings suggested an obsessive interest in the investigation's progress that went far beyond normal community concern. More disturbing were photographs of the annual vigils for Laura, pictures that Brennan had apparently taken from his apartment window, showing the crowds gathered in the building's parking lot. The photos included close-ups of Maria Santos and Sofia Reyes during their most vulnerable moments, images that suggested Brennan had been monitoring the family's grief with disturbing attention to detail. Detective Martinez conducted the initial interview with Brennan at Burlington Police Headquarters, a conversation that revealed a man whose carefully maintained facade had finally cracked under the weight of 14 years of hidden guilt. Brennan initially attempted to deny any involvement in Laura's disappearance, claiming that his DNA might have been transferred to her car through innocent contact in the apartment building's shared spaces. But when confronted with the specificity of the evidence, fiber samples from inside the vehicle rather than external surfaces, Brennan's demeanor changed dramatically. The cooperative neighbor persona dissolved, replaced by periods of silence punctuated by cryptic statements about Laura's beauty, her kindness to him, and his regret about how things ended up happening. "She was always nice to me," Brennan told Detective Martinez during one particularly revealing exchange. "When other people in the building treated me like I was invisible, Laura always said hello, asked how I was doing. I never wanted to hurt her. It wasn't supposed to happen that way." The admission stopped short of a complete confession, but it provided investigators with crucial insight into Brennan's psychology and potential motives. The case appeared to involve a neighbor who had developed an unhealthy obsession with Laura, leading to a confrontation that had escalated beyond his original intentions. News of Brennan's arrest spread through Burlington with remarkable speed, creating shockwaves that reverberated through every corner of the community that had lived with Laura's unsolved disappearance for nearly 15 years. The revelation that her killer had been living among them, attending vigils, offering assistance to investigators, maintaining the facade of a concerned neighbor, challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and safety that went to the heart of small-town identity. Margaret Patterson, who still lived across the hall from Brennan's apartment, described feeling physically sick when she realized how close she had been to a suspected killer for so many years. "I brought him cookies at Christmas," she told reporters. "I asked him to help with heavy lifting. The thought that he was capable of something like this, it makes you question everything you think you know about people." The arrest had solved Burlington's most notorious cold case, but it had also created new traumas for a community that would need to process the betrayal of trust that made Laura's murder possible. The investigation had revealed not just a killer, but the disturbing ease with which predators could hide among their victims' friends and neighbors. The Chittenden County Superior Court had never hosted a trial quite like the one that convened on October 2, 2023, when Thomas Michael Brennan faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault in connection with Laura Reyes's death 14 years earlier. Judge Margaret Sullivan presided over proceedings that attracted national media attention, transforming Burlington's usually quiet courthouse into the focal point for a case that had captivated true crime followers and forensic science enthusiasts across the country. Prosecutor District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Detective Captain Walsh, had spent 5 months preparing a case that relied heavily on DNA evidence, circumstantial proof, and Brennan's own partial admissions during police interviews. The prosecution's strategy focused on establishing a timeline of obsession and opportunity, showing how Brennan had used his position as Laura's neighbor to study her routines, gain access to her vehicle, and ultimately commit murder when his advances were rejected. The DNA evidence formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, with Dr. Sarah Chen providing detailed testimony about the genetic analysis that had identified Brennan as the source of biological material found in Laura's Honda Civic. The scientific testimony was complex, requiring careful explanation of low copy number DNA analysis, STR markers, and statistical probability calculations that demonstrated the virtual impossibility of the evidence matching anyone other than the defendant. The defendant's DNA was not simply present in the victim's vehicle, Dr. Chen explained to the jury during her testimony. The location and nature of the evidence suggests intimate contact, consistent with a violent struggle. The probability of this evidence appearing through innocent transfer is so remote as to be scientifically impossible. Defense attorney Michael Romano faced the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt despite overwhelming forensic evidence, arguing that the DNA samples could have been contaminated or that Brennan's presence in Laura's car might have occurred through previously unknown consensual contact. The defense strategy relied on questioning the reliability of 14-year-old evidence and suggesting that other suspects had never been properly investigated or eliminated. But the prosecution's case extended far beyond DNA evidence to include the disturbing collection of materials found in Brennan's apartment, his intimate knowledge of Laura's schedule and habits, and his suspicious behavior during the original investigation. Detective Martinez testified about Brennan's overly detailed accounts of Laura's movements, his volunteering of information that hadn't been requested, and his apparent attempts to insert himself into the investigation. The emotional centerpiece of the trial came when Sophia Reyes, now 32 years old and a social worker in Massachusetts, testified about her mother's disappearance and its impact on her life. Her testimony provided the jury with a human face for the victim while establishing Laura's character as a devoted mother who would never have voluntarily abandoned her teenage daughter. "My mother was the most reliable person I knew," Sophia told the court, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "She called if she was going to be 5 minutes late. She never missed a school event or forgot a birthday. The idea that she would just disappear without explanation was impossible from the very first night." Maria Santos also testified, describing 14 years of keeping Laura's memory alive through vigils, advocacy, and the symbolic porch light that had burned continuously since her sister's disappearance. Maria's testimony highlighted the family's persistent hope and the community's commitment to finding answers, providing context for the prosecution's argument that justice had been delayed but not denied. The defense's case relied primarily on challenging the scientific evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for Brennan's behavior. Romano argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial rather than definitive proof of murder, and that Brennan's collection of newspaper clippings reflected genuine concern for a missing neighbor rather than guilty knowledge. The defense called expert witnesses to question the reliability of low copy number DNA analysis and the statistical calculations used to establish the evidence's significance. But Brennan himself never testified, a decision that allowed prosecutors to reference his partial admissions during police interviews without subjecting him to cross-examination. The defendant's statements about Laura being nice to him and his regret about how things ended up happening became crucial evidence that suggested both motive and consciousness of guilt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, a decision that brought closure to one of Vermont's most notorious cold cases, while raising broader questions about DNA evidence, community safety, and the persistence required to solve complex crimes. The verdict was announced on October 20, 2023, nearly 14 years to the day after Laura's disappearance. Judge Sullivan sentenced Brennan to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his betrayal of community trust and exploitation of his position as Laura's neighbor represented particularly aggravating factors. The sentence ensured that Brennan would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated, providing a measure of justice that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Outside the courthouse, Maria Santos addressed the media and community members who had gathered to witness the conclusion of the case that had defined Burlington's collective memory for nearly 15 years. Today we have justice for Laura, but more importantly, we have proof that persistence and hope can overcome even the most challenging circumstances, Maria said, her voice carrying across the crowd of supporters, investigators, and journalists who had followed the case to its conclusion. The trial's conclusion marked the end of active proceedings, but the beginning of a different kind of healing for Burlington's residents, who could finally move forward, knowing that Laura's killer would never again threaten their community's safety or peace of mind. On the evening of October 20th, 2023, Maria Santos walked slowly up the stairs to 47 Maple Street for what she knew would be the final time in her role as keeper of Laura's memory. The burgundy Honda Civic was long gone. Laura's apartment had been rented to new tenants years earlier, but the porch light that had burned continuously for nearly 14 years still glowed against the autumn darkness. With trembling hands, Maria reached up and switched off the light that had become Burlington's most recognizable symbol of hope, persistence, and a family's refusal to accept that some questions would remain forever unanswered. The darkness that followed felt different from the despair that had consumed this same spot in December 2009. This was the darkness of completion, rather than abandonment, the natural conclusion of a vigil that had finally achieved its purpose. Laura Reyes would never come home, but her killer had been brought to justice through the combined efforts of advancing forensic science, persistent detective work, and a community that had refused to let her disappearance fade into forgotten tragedy. The case of Laura Reyes had become a testament to the power of technological advancement in criminal justice, demonstrating how DNA analysis techniques that were experimental in 2009 had become routine tools for solving cold cases. Sarah Chen's breakthrough had been made possible by decades of scientific progress, federal funding for forensic laboratories, and the foresight of investigators who had carefully preserved evidence even when it seemed useless with available technology. But technology alone had not solved Laura's case. The breakthrough required Detective Captain Walsh's commitment to periodic case reviews, Maria Santos's relentless advocacy for continued attention, and the Burlington community's collective memory that kept Laura's story alive long enough for science to catch up with justice. The lesson was clear: cold cases are solved through the combination of advancing capabilities and persistent human effort, rather than either element alone. The investigation had also revealed disturbing truths about predatory behavior and community vulnerability that extended far beyond Burlington's city limits. Thomas Brennan's ability to maintain a facade of helpful cooperation while hiding his involvement in Laura's murder demonstrated how dangerous individuals often exploit positions of trust and familiarity to avoid suspicion. His attendance at vigils for his own victim represented a level of psychological manipulation that challenged basic assumptions about criminal behavior and community safety. For Burlington's residents, Laura's case had permanently altered the balance between openness and caution that defined small-town life. The community had learned to maintain its essential character while implementing security measures and awareness protocols that acknowledged the reality of random violence. The changes represented growth rather than paranoia, evolution rather than surrender to fear. The legal precedents established by Brennan's conviction would influence how Vermont prosecutors approached cases involving familial DNA searching and genetic genealogy evidence. The successful prosecution demonstrated that these advanced techniques could withstand courtroom scrutiny while respecting constitutional protections, creating a model for other jurisdictions seeking to solve cold cases through similar methods. Perhaps most importantly, Laura Reyes's story had become a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, that families and communities possess the power to keep cases alive through persistence and advocacy until breakthrough moments arrive. The 14 years between Laura's disappearance and Brennan's conviction had felt endless to those who loved her, but they represented just a brief pause in the larger arc of accountability and truth. As Burlington moved forward from the case that had defined its collective identity for nearly 15 years, residents carried with them lessons about resilience, community solidarity, and the importance of never accepting that some tragedies are simply too complex to solve. Laura Reyes's memory would live on, not just in the hearts of those who loved her, but in the knowledge that her story had made justice possible for other victims, whose cases might otherwise have remained forever cold. The porch light at 47 Maple Street would never burn again for Laura, but its message had illuminated a path forward for countless other families seeking answers, hope, and the promise that truth has the power to emerge even from the deepest darkness. Laura Reyes's story is a reminder that the truth may hide in silence, but it cannot hide forever. In Burlington, Vermont, and in communities across the country, the light of justice continues to burn for those whose voices have been silenced, but whose stories refuse to be forgotten.